Um, okay, so the summary of everything I've set up to now, go to frame by frame animation on YouTube and check out some of these. So really the point of all of these are to show that uh, the level of polish and detail that is added in sort of that last phase, right? A lot of this is going to happen like in the graph editor. So my hopes is that by this point, you're not afraid of the graph editor anymore, right? You may still like not love it, but a vast majority of this, if you've done your job right up to this point, is going to be in the graph editor. At this point, you should have gone through all your poses. Your poses are really strong. I mean, by the time you get to splining, I know you're all still working a little bit on blocking plus, but by the time you get to splining, all of your poses should be strong, all of your silhouettes should be clean, and if all of that's true, your timing should be working well. If that's true, then really all you have to do is make that stuff in between work better, right? Make those transitions just as strong as the rest of it. So let's hop into Maya here just for a second and talk about this box. This box is moving from one side of the screen to the other. So get in here a little closer. I'm going to go ahead and open up my graph editor down below this just so you can see it. Single pane stacked. This one I will do graph editor. There we go. So, a little bit of a trick question here, but I'm gonna be asking you all questions and looking for answers. So I'll just be quiet until you all actually answer, which may so I need you all to participate in this a little bit here. And some of these are going to be pretty obvious to you right off the bat here. This box is moving from one side of the screen to the other. So what all we have like translate X, translate Y, translate Z, rotate X, rotate Y, rotate Z. What is changing between these two keyframes? Like which of those axes, which of those values are changing? What? Translate X. So yes. So there's a rotate X too, right? But one of the ways we can tell that's kind of easy to tell. That's the only curve that is different on here, right? That red curve is the only one that is not the same all the way across, right? So if I go through here, translate Y, that is the up and down channel, right? But translate X, and it's not changing at all because my box isn't going up and down. Z, that's the box going further away from me or closer to me. We can't really tell from this perspective, but it's not. It's just going up and down. And we have no rotates on any of these. We only have a change happening in translate X, right? And just sort of a reminder, if this is a little vague to you about how the graph editor works, so that side-to-side direction, like left and right, in the graph editor represents what? If I go further to the left or further to the right, what am I changing? Time, right? So if I go more that direction, we're going backwards. We're going backwards in time, right? If I go this direction, we're going forwards in time. Side to side is always time. That is something that is really, like, probably one of the confusing things. Side to side is not, it doesn't have anything to do with space, right? The direction. Side to side is just time. So what is up and down then? What does the up and down value represent in this graph?
Whatever thing it is that you're adjusting. So in this case, it's translate X.
So yeah, it's the value of translate X over here. And in this case, the value of translate X is the side-to-side movement of the box, right? So as this curve goes upward, what happens to the box?
It's moving in a positive direction.
Yeah, so it's moving to our right.
It was in the positive direction.
Yeah, because it's actually negative X. You can see the direction that X is pointing in that little locator in the bottom corner. The direction that the line is pointing, this little red line, is the positive direction, so that means that's the negative direction. So yeah, it's moving in positive x. So as the value goes up, right, as this curve goes up, the box moves further in this direction. Right? We're all pretty familiar with that because we were all traumatized by the graph editor arrow in animation fundamentals. You all still wake up like shivering from that, like bad nightmares? No? Y'all all right with that?
I thought it was all right.
Good.
It wasn't too bad.
Good. So the point of that exercise was to make you comfortable in the graph editor. So at this point, you should be pretty comfortable in there. So that's why when I start asking you all some questions about it here in a minute, you know, I'm going to need you to kind of harken back to that. Remind yourself how this works so you can answer those. So again, right now, this is only changing in one value. Right? And you all know that like if we change this in multiple values, we would get a different result, right? One of the ways I could do that is I could add extra keys, right? Or I don't even have to add extra keys. I could just change my translate y and move this value up, right? And you're going to see my box does that, right? Or I could go to keys, add key tool, select this curve, and insert a new key right here in the middle. And you're going to see now that this motion is a combination of two values changing, right? The up and down value and the side to side value. So everything that you've changed in your animation, every control that you have manipulated in some way or another, whether it's rotating the arm or whether it's rolling up on the foot or whether it's moving the character's root control, center of gravity control, all of those are generating these curves. Okay, I know this is stuff you already know. It's to kind of remind you. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Let's just focus on this one value changing, right? Now, if I were to select this box and go to the animation menu here and go to Visualize, Create Editable Motion Trail, it's going to create a curve here of what that motion looks like, right? And of course, if I had that other curve in here, or other key in here, you know, we're going to get an arc in it, right? If we had more of that, right? So this is just a path of what the curve is doing. I'm going to go ahead and select that curve or this path, and go to my attribute editor just so we can visualize this a little bit better, and turn on Show Frame Crosses. So you all should be able to see those little tick marks in there now. Make them a little bit bigger so you can see them, right? So what those tick marks represent is each frame of the animation, not each keyframe, but where it is every frame of this animation, every frame of this motion, right? So frame 22, you can see it's that tick mark right there, right? And then we go forward to 23, it's that tick mark there. So I know we briefly talked about this last class period, but what's the term we use to refer to that distance between each of those tick marks?
Spacing?
In between.
Spacing. Yeah. So the in between is all of that stuff that is happening between our two keyframes, right? Everything from frame 2 to 47. The distance that they travel, the space that it travels every frame, is the spacing of the motion, right? And so while we're looking at those dots, we can also see our translate X curve here. Now this gets a little annoying sometimes, that if I try to grab a keyframe here, all my curves come back, and that's just annoying. One of the ways you can turn that off is to just uncheck this box here. And so now when I turn on that, it doesn't do that anymore. So this spacing should make sense to us. Because if this value represents the distance, or this curve represents the distance, or how our box is traveling from left to right, we'll see that it eases in at the beginning, which means the distance it's traveling from frame 1 to 2 is really small, right? But the distance it's traveling sort of through the middle here, 24 to 25 is pretty big, right? And that makes sense, right? It's accelerating. If we sort of scale this a little differently so you can see it, this value is climbing higher, right, through the middle here than it is at the end when we get to right here at the end of this animation, right? So the amount that that value is changing up and down is smaller than the change that's happening right there. And so you can see that with these tick marks because they're closer together on the ends, right? That's the spacing of this. So we have a very fine amount of control on how this box goes from point A to point B, right? What if I wanted the spacing to be the same from every frame? What would I have to do to this curve to make that happen? Linear. Okay. So what would that look like then? Just a perfectly straight diagonal line. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I select both of those keyframes, I click this button right here. This will change it to linear. Right, now you'll see my spacing is perfectly even from box to box, right? Or from tick mark to tick mark. Okay, so there's some other options I have here that just relate to editing this curve. So let's edit this curve just a little bit and see some of the results we get. So as I've shown you, I can add keys to this, right? One of the things I do to instead of having to go up here to this add key tool every time, I actually usually go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Hotkey Editor. And then I can choose a category, Editors, Graph Editor, choose this Add Key tool, and then I usually wire it to something like T, because I don't really use T very much in the Graph Editor. And now I can quickly add a key tool with like hitting the T key and just putting it wherever I want to, right? But I can actually still manipulate this without having to even add more keyframes, right? I can do that just by adjusting these tangents. So a couple of, sometimes people struggle with editing their tangents, right? The reason for that is because you get used to actually clicking on something and you think that you have to I have to click on that little bitty orange dot right there to be able to select it. But you don't. Like you can actually just click drag and highlight it, and since that's the only keyframe within that highlighted region, it'll select it. The same with your tangent. A lot of people will have this issue when they're trying to select their tangent and they miss and select the entire curve, and then they're messing up their entire animation, right? You don't have to do that. If you've selected a keyframe, you can drag select the end of the tangent, and that will select it as well. Right? Now, if I need to move it, I can just click with my left mouse button here and manipulate it. But again, if I miss, if I click like here and manipulate it, I just accidentally unselected it and selected the entire curve instead. So that's just a pain in the butt. The method I use for selecting and editing tangents, and it's really quick once you get the hang of it, is you drag select the keyframe, drag select the tangent, and then anywhere in the graph editor, I can middle click and adjust that tangent. Okay? So this will allow you to very quickly go through and start editing tangents. And I want to break that one just so it's not. All right. And so I can make all sorts of changes here. So, so one of the changes I can do in this one is I can drag this. I can drag this tangent by holding Shift. I can drag it this way, right? And so now I'm increasing the amount of ease at the top here. I could also grab this tangent, break it, and move it up, and I'm increasing the spacing at the beginning, right? So this is coming out of here really fast, right? There's not a lot of, like the distance is traveling from frame 1 to 2 is a pretty big distance because that's a big change in the curve. But the frame from frame 47 to 48 is barely a change at all, right? In fact, it almost seems like it's going backwards. Let's fix that a little bit. Probably went up a little bit with this tangent. I did. Right, and so it's very small changes right there toward the end. So the result of that is an animation that plays like that. It's really fast at the beginning, slows down. It feels like it's been hit in the back, right? And it knocks it forward and sort of gradually eases to a stop. Is this all feeling pretty familiar to you? Feeling pretty comfortable with this? Okay. One more quick reminder of how this works. There are a lot of presets in here for these tangents. I can drag select all of this. I can choose like this one, and that's like that stepped mode. So how we're enabling stepped preview. What we're going to see here is it's going to hold that key until the very end and snap to it, right? Why would you need that? Like, I mean, yeah, we use it for animating in stepped mode. Maybe if we're going to put it in like stepped mode so we can animate on twos, like in the Spider-Verse or something like that. But is that the only reasons you would use it? Can you think of another reason to use stepped mode? Why you'd need something to be one value until it instantaneously transfers into another value?
It could be
If
just.
something cuts from one thing to another thing.
Like a camera cut?
Yeah.
So we could do that. The only problem, so I will give you kind of a little bit of a warning on a camera cut. Motion blur still happens on that. So if you instantaneously transfer the motion from one place to the other, your first and last frames of those shots will be really blurry because the camera moves really fast. But yeah, that is one of the reasons. Like if we needed something to like look like it was disappearing from one place and reappearing somewhere else, maybe you were
It was
gonna-
kind of the same thing.
Same thing? So think of this not only in terms of motion, but in any value, right? These curves are generated on all sorts of different values, like FK-IK switching, right? You need your arms to transfer from being an FK on frame 20 to IK on frame 21, right? We can have that happen in a single step, because if you have a range of time where both arms are controlling it, then it's really hard to control specifically where the arm is. You have two different controls that are both trying to manipulate the same arm. Does that make sense? One of the more common types of uses you would see with this is like turning on a light, right? Let's say you have a value in a light, somebody flips a light switch, like literally you can set a keyframe on the intensity of that light and set that to stepped mode so it instantly changes from 0 to 1, right? Or for 0.2 to 1 or whatever you want it to be. So there's a lot of reasons you may want to use something like this sometimes. So I'm going to go ahead and set that back to auto here. Okay. Y'all with me? Yeah. Okay. So far, Amy's the only one who's nodded her head. So let's try it again. Y'all with me?
Yep.
All right, because here comes the interactive portion of the show. Control H. Anybody seen this before?
Just a simpler version of it.
So, for the most part, these animations are all very similar, right? They all start pretty much in the same place. They all end pretty much in the same place. The only difference is what's happening on the graph between those two. The only one that really is different is J, like we go a little bit, past it and everything. So, what I'd like you to do is take out a piece of paper, or you're setting in front of Cintiqs if you'd rather sketch this out on a Cintiq. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on one of these, and I want you to guess what the curve looks like. Yeah. So I'm being nice because when Kat took this class, this was a graded test. So this is just to speed this along because the graded test took like 45 minutes. This will be more like a conversation. So take out a piece of paper. Let's zoom in here on this one. And these first few, they're going to be pretty easy, right? They're gonna be familiar, right? So let's start with A. I want you to look at A. So some of the telltale signs of A here are spacing is kind of big in the middle. Spacing is kind of small at the end. That may seem familiar, right? What do you think this curve looks like? Take a second and just draw a little box on your piece of paper and try to draw that curve in between it, right? So what did you get? What's the curve that some of you drew?
That normal kind of S curve.
Yeah, kind of a lazy S curve. So let's check and see if you're right. What's that? What? Okay. So yep, there you are. It's back. So very similar to what we started off with at the very beginning of this, right? So let's go ahead and hide that one, and we'll also maybe hide A. Why can't I hide A? Oh, it's because it's locked. Okay, so let's just look at B now. So I've hidden A, so it'll be the topmost piece here. So some of the notable elements of this are the spacing, right? Or is the spacing. So take a minute really quick and try to draw what you think this curve looks like.
Which one did we do?
B.
I thought we just did B.
No, we did A.
We did A.
I thought we did A and B.
No. You can't do both.
Well, we did. We did talk about something like A or A and B earlier, but. So what did you get for B?
It's linear.
So just a diagonal line, right? So again, when we say this is linear, it means that the value of change is the same from frame to frame, right? The value of change from 18 to 19 is the same from 1 to 2. And so that means when we graph that, we get a very straight line, right? It's changing consistently as time is changing consistently. All right, and so these next two are also going to be somewhat familiar. Let's look at C. Oh, almost clicked it. Almost gave it away. What do you think's happening on C? Yeah, so go ahead and try drawing that. Actually, let's go ahead and do C and D at the same time. What does C look like and what does D look like? Okay. So, are there any, yeah. So we have some dry erase markers over here and like 3/4 of an inch of empty space on this board back here on the back. Who wants to volunteer to draw C and who wants to volunteer to draw D? So we got C, who's going to do D? Oh, I think Maggie beat you to D. Oh, I think you just volunteered for E. So back there on the board, just try, Chris, you want to do C, you can do E. I'm sorry, C and D, yes.
C and D.
Well, you're doing C, Maggie's doing D. How many of you agree with them? Any disagreements? All right. So C and D. How many of you think C is right? What Chris drew from C is right.
Those are reversed. No, I'm pretty sure.
I have 100%
Because C goes like
sure.
straight and then like up fast, and then D goes down or like fast up and then straight.
Y'all want to try it? Let's see how they compare. So C. So C is very similar to what Chris drew there. So think about it. It's time is side to side, value is up and down, right? And so the value is changing very big, a very large amount at the beginning here. And then that value change decreases here. Yeah. Okay, and then what Maggie had is also very close to correct. So good job, give them a hand. Look at that, they hung it out there. They hung their necks out. So, all right, so who wants to try E? Let's look at E first. E, it's fun to say. So let's look at E. E is interesting. Wait, I almost selected it. E is interesting. So it goes really fast at the beginning and end, but it's slow in the middle. What is happening there? Yeah, got a question? Or?
I know what it is.
You know what it
I
is?
know what it is.
I'm not as confident anymore. You can take it.
You're not going. Let's try it. Let's see if you can get E. So while he's doing that, why don't the rest of you take a stab at it too?
Draw E up there.
Yeah, try drawing it up there, and the rest of you try drawing it on the paper while you can, or while he's walking up there. So think about that, changing fast at the beginnings and the ends, right? But not as fast in the middle.
Everybody draw it now?
Okay, everybody ready for him to draw it?
Yes.
Everybody got their votes locked in?
Sure.
Yep, go for it.
It's the same as A except flipped.
Oh, interesting way of looking at that. So, how many of you drew that too? All right. So yeah, about that. So let's go ahead and check that out and see. What is
One
that?
of them is eased at the beginning and the end, and the other one is eased in the middle.
Yeah. So yeah, we get this fast motion at the beginning and the end. And what we get is this hesitation in the middle, right? It's not traveling up and down as fast, right? But it is at the beginning and the end. What is this? Ah, I'm giving it away. I'm giving it away. Like the. Okay. So F, for those of you who weren't paying attention when I accidentally clicked on it.
I wasn't.
So F is a little different. Okay. I think we're gonna, Chris, have a seat. I think we're gonna let somebody else take a stab at this one. Although.
This is the one thing that I know what's going on.
Okay. Well, you'll still get the chance to make a guess. So this one's a little different. There's a third keyframe in here. Right? And it's also a little different than E, because even though it slows down in the middle, it's also easing out at the beginning and the end. So what's happening there? Break. Want to take a stab at it? Somebody want to try who hasn't tried one yet? On the board? Going once.
Here, I'll do it.
Go for it.
Good.
Yeah. So think of it. It's easing out at frame 1, easing in frame 24, and then out of frame 24 again, it eases, goes fast in the middle, eases into 48. And there's 3 keyframes.
Okay, am I ready?
Okay, everybody else is sort of taking their doodle shot at it? Okay, go for it. How many of you agree with him? Yeah, I do too. I do too. Let's see. So the way to think about this, and this is actually a really handy one to think about, right? It's like this value is like climbing a hill, right? And it got tired halfway in the middle, right? Like we're going up a hill, but then there's like a little bit of a plateau where the incline slows down again, and then you start going up the hill again, right? It's like a soft step, right? And we can see that happening. Like we ease out at the beginning, goes fast around frame 10 or 11, and then eases in at 24 or 25, right? Eases back out of that one again, goes fast to this middle, like 37-ish, and then eases in again at 48. Right? Now this is really handy to recognize because this is just the change in a motion's like velocity, and how quickly a motion is changing. Right? The interesting thing is if I were to just grab this and hit auto tangent on that, that's A again, right? All that this really means is we have a hesitation through the middle of that move, right? If our character is raising their arm, right, and I want it to look like a quick like arm raise, like this, like they're throwing something, then it's going to be sort of like smooth through that middle portion, right? But if I want it to feel like they sort of hesitate halfway up and then finish raising their arm, I can have this little area where it flattens out a little bit and then continues forward again, right? So this is a very like handy little thing to recognize. This is just a change in a value over time. Okay, good job. Control H. So G. Now, G may be a little confusing because there's only 3 keyframes. And it's going past one of them and then coming back and going before it and then going forward again, right? Like, what is happening there? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Okay, go for it. And then, Chris, I'll let you get the next one here. Well, actually, the next one we may just do out loud. If you need to draw the tangents to help on this one, you're welcome to do it. And the rest of you, try it out on your paper too at the same time. Go for it. How many of you got something like that? Yeah, so let's check that out. Let's grab it and see. Yeah. So remember, we can use that tangent to alter this, right? And we can have it shoot past our keyframe before it even gets to it, right? Now, my personal opinion, I don't like doing that with just the tangent in an actual animation, but this is overshoot, right? We overshot that middle key, came back, and then went on to the other, right? So this is like we're overshooting it and coming back. Now, what I like to do personally is just go ahead and add a keyframe there and manually control my overshoot like this. So this is how I would actually probably do it in the if I were using this in a project. And the reason for that is if I change anything on this keyframe, I can still maintain that exact point of overshoot versus if I don't and I change this keyframe, you see how it's like coming up and just touching like the 20 point there? If I change anything to do with this keyframe, it's no longer hitting that 20, right? And so sometimes I like to be in full control of where that's going to hit. Right? But that's just how I work. Everybody works a little differently. And I've worked with animators who use their tangents to do their overshoot, so that's fine. All right, so this one should be relatively easy just to do out loud. How many of you think you know what's happening in H? Just Chris? Anybody else know what's happening in H? I'm not asking you to volunteer to go up and draw it. So what's happening in it? It's in stepped mode, right? Okay. So we're getting a little more complicated once we get to I here, though. So something I want you to notice is we have 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 keyframes in this. I better. That's a good point. So I. Maybe think you know what's going on in this one. Go for it, Chris. Let's do it. If you want to, yeah. So the interesting thing to think about this is you all have animated a bouncing ball before. Right? So you probably remember what your Y curve was doing, right? Well, this is just bouncing off of a wall, right? So Okay, go for it. How many of you think that's what it's doing? All right, so that included breaking some tangents, right? Yep, you can sit down. That was it. That included breaking some tangents in order to get that, right? We had to go in here, we had to select this break tangent option here in order to get this impact points, right? Where it hits, bounces off, and bounces again. And it's actually really easy to add those, right? I could add a couple of other little bounces here just with my add key tool, right? Very quickly get even a second little bounce, right? So we get all right, last one. This one isn't even really the hardest one, but what's going on with I? Or yeah, I'm sorry, J. So let's try drawing it on the paper, and anybody want to volunteer to go to the board? Everybody? Okay. Go for it, Chris. No, you're liking the graph editor. That's awesome. I have a feeling a lot of people just don't like going to the board. It's less than the graph editor.
I don't like my drawing on the whiteboard anyway. That's what I
Yeah.
did last time.
So what do y'all think it is? You're going to be drawing it at the same time as Chris. Okay, you can draw it, Chris. So let's check it. Yeah. So this has a term in actually this is addressing two of the principles, right? We have an anticipation and we have a follow through. Thanks for right. We have our box anticipates back and then shoots forward, overshoots their ending pose, and comes back to the final pose, right? So I think it's important to look at these last few here because these are curves that you are going to manipulate quite a bit. Like these are effects that you might be wanting to get with the graph editor as you're working. So, all right, good job, y'all. So I am going to go through a couple of things today. Up in the resource folder, I'm going to go through folder 3 here, and we're going to watch some of those. But I also wanted to point out the splining checklist. It's a PDF that's up there. That's yours to do with whatever you want. And I'll drag this in here, right? So once we get to the splining phase, like why do we call this splines? Like why are we calling it splining? What does that even mean? What is a spline? Spine of the line. I kind of, yeah, actually. A spline is it comes from a sort of an old way, Bezier spline is what we would call it. It's a curve that is generated by a Bezier handle, right? But that explains how our curves are generated inside of the graph editor. So splining, the phrase that we use for that, is basically going in and manipulating our curves, right? This is the point where we have posed and posed and posed. We've done all of our key poses, all of our breakdowns, everything we can do just by rotating stuff and putting it into a pose. We are finally forced to go into the graph editor, right? So this is the graph editor editing portion of the show. At this point, you can recognize that most of your animation is going to have all of the keyframes still on the same frames, right? The keyframe for your arm is on the same location on the timeline as the keyframe on your hips and on your foot, right? It's all happening together because we're working in that stepped mode. Splining is how we start to make that very planned execution of this action feel more loose and malleable and organic, right? Now, there's a method in which I usually go through almost every shot that I do. Because most of your action is happening because of your character's root motion. And when I say your root, it's like the center of gravity, like that controller around your character's hips that move their entire torso around, but their feet still stay stuck to the floor. That control is driving most of your character's action, right? If you think about that, that control is what tells us how the character is pushing against the floor in order to shift their hips around. It also, like, if my hips are going somewhere, my arms don't get a choice, right? They're coming along, right? I can't leave them at home. So that means most of the motion is happening starting with that root motion. Or your character rig may call it center of gravity. It may call it hips. There's a lot of different things that can be called, right? So the first thing I do is I go through all of the curves that I have set keyframes on my center of gravity. That is translate X, Y, and Z, rotate X, Y, and Z, and sometimes scale X, Y, and Z if it's got any squash and stretch on the torso, right? That is one of the ways that is sort of set up. And there are actually sometimes that control will just have a squash and stretch value on it. Now when I say go through all those curves, I mean I am going to analyze in the same way that we were analyzing that box, every little bit of motion in every channel. Right? I'm going to look at the translate X, and I'm going to be like, should this be moving forward at this time, or should it be one frame later? Should it ease into this motion? Should it overshoot? Should I hold it longer? And all of those things I'm going to manipulate by editing that curve. Right? Usually what I do is I rotate my character into in the perspective view, and I'll have both views open, and I'll show you this here in a minute. And I'll rotate my camera around to where I can see the character where I'm only able to pay attention to that axis, right? So if it's translate X, that's the character's forward and backward motion. I will rotate my camera over to the side and edit just that curve, right? Until I get that curve doing what I want it to do. Focusing on it one curve at a time. So I'm going to edit all the necessary root curves. I'm going to check the relationship between the feet and the root and offset if needed. Okay. So what I mean there is if my character takes a step to their right, that means that they're sort of first pushing with their right foot to take the weight off of this foot. And then they're stretching to get this contact here. Well, that means this foot has to get over there first, or I'm just going to fall on the floor, right? If my hips and my leg get over there at the same time, my hips are going to keep going and I'm going to fall over, right? So my foot has to get out there ahead of me to catch myself, to slow myself down, right? So I may have to take that foot key and slide it a little bit earlier, right? I may want to make it look like this foot is continuing to push, so it may stay back here a frame or two later, right? So offsetting that time on those keys is really one of the most important parts of getting believable weight, right? So I'm going to check the relationship between my feet. I'm going to offset as needed. I'm going to also edit all necessary curves on the feet. So if I want them to feel like they're slapping down, I'm going to have to break a tangent. Or if I need some ease in and ease out, I can work with that. So this is really, that right there, is really like, you can't phone that stage in, right? Like that is like, you are defining, you're defining the details of how, this chair's too high. You're defining the details of how this character's overall motion is happening. Everything you change in here will affect the rest of the character, the spine, the arms, the head, right? Everything will be affected by this. So this is something that I spend a long time making sure is accurate. After I get that though, y'all remember the pendulum exercise from Animation Fundamentals, right? So the rest of this, or not the rest of it, but this next step I think of kind of similarly as how I thought of that pendulum exercise. Now it's not all overlapping action led by the hips, but the spine and the torso is something that is being affected by the way that root motion is happening, right? So my spine and my torso, I'm going to edit all necessary curves on spine controls working up the spine, right? So if I have 3 spine controls, I'll edit the lowest one first, look at the rotate XYZ, the translate XYZ if I have them, and then I'll go up to the next one, rotate XYZ, translate XYZ. And what I'm thinking about here is how is the motion of the hips affecting or being affected by that root control, right? So in the same way, like when your pendulum platform came to a sudden stop, you had to ask yourself, well, how will that affect that next pendulum arm down, right? And you are going to manually manipulate that to make that interaction or make that reaction happen believably. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is being dragged around by my character's hips, right? Sometimes the head leads that, right? Sometimes what's happening is my hips haven't started moving yet, but my head is dipping forward, right? Because I'm leading with my head, like I'm doing something like this, right? But I will look at that relationship all throughout the spine and say, how are these affecting each other? How is the motion of the hips going to affect or be affected by these controls? After that, I'm going to edit all necessary curves on the head control. So really, I'm just working my way up my spine through the head, right? So in most cases, I animate my arms in FK. The only time I really animate it in IK is if they're locked to something, like if I need my character to climb up onto something, or if they're standing, like leaning against something. I'll put that arm in IK so it will stay locked in that one position no matter where my character moves to, right? But if my character's arms are just free, I usually animate them in FK. That doesn't mean you have to. Maybe you like IK better. It's faster to pose in IK. It's a little harder to get that overlapping action feel and clean arcs. But both have pros and cons. If you're animating in FK, I work on all of the curves going down the arm. I start with the clavicle, go to the shoulder, go to the elbow, go to the wrist. And if I have some time, I even work a little bit on the fingers, right? And I do that down both arms. Now at this point, you've hit all of the major limbs, right? You've hit the torso, you've hit the legs, you've hit the arms and the head, right? So now we're sort of starting to get into some of the detail stuff. But before we do that, we want to take a look at our offsetting, our overlapping action, right? So you probably built a little bit of that overlapping action into the curves. It's important to remember that you are no longer locked down in time, right? If you decide this should happen a little later, there's nothing wrong with that, right? This is where you get a chance to do this, like throughout any of this editing, right? And if I want my step to the side to feel faster, I can make these curves closer together, right? If I want to anticipate later, right? I can do all of this, and this is where I get a chance to change the way those are happening. So I'm not just moving them up and down, I'm kind of regenerating this curve. I'm remanipulating this curve to get the curve that is perfect for that axis of motion, right? And you'll see this a lot more when we look at the time lapse of this. So I'm going to get a little bit of offsetting happening just because of that. But some of the other things that I'm going to get is stuff like if I offset my root, my hips control, my center of gravity control, if I offset the translate keys to happen one frame before the rotate keys, like that's an interesting result, right? So think about that. If this were a feather, right, and I were waving it around, what would happen is I would move it from the bottom in this direction, and the rotation that I would get in that rig to make that happen would be a rotation that happened as a result of that translation, right? So I would have to move one frame forward before the tip of this even heard about it, right? And so having translations happening just a little bit before rotations, like 1 frame before, loosens it up just a little bit. It's not a major change, but it really does kind of, it just kind of adds a little bit of something to it, right? I'm also going to offset the spine and head controls to show lead and follow. Now, if your character is very loose and sway, Jack Sparrow-y, right, then what's happening is the hips are leading that, and the rest of the spine is it's doing the pendulum thing, right? The hips are leading, the rest of your spine is kind of acting like a pendulum, swinging your entire torso around, right? But if a character is more eager or like urgent about something, you'll get the opposite. They'll be leading with their head. Their head will lean forward before their hips start to move, right? And so I can do that just by offsetting the head motion to happen a frame earlier, or offsetting the hip motion to happen a frame later, right? And so I can make the character feel a little bit more like that, right? They're pushing their hand forward, right? So I can do that up the spine and through the head controls to get this lead and follow feel. And then after that, I can offset down the arms to show lead and follow. So again, the same. If I want it to be very loose arm gesture, the forearm happens after the shoulder, the hand happens after the forearm. But if I want it to feel urgent and like I'm really expressing myself, like pleading, right? Or even like I guess urgent is the right word, like yes, right? That's going to start with the hand, right? The hand is going to be like happening first. So how I'm offsetting this may happen across the entire animation, or it may happen just like one little section feels like a little bit of a more urgent hand gesture before this unfolding gesture that happens in the opposite order. So I'm offsetting sections of this to loosen it up. And then after that, I'm going to offset each of the arms to reduce twinning where necessary. So twinning is a term we use when both sides of your character are doing exactly the same thing, right? And it doesn't always have to be straight to camera. You know, it can still be my character's twinning like this, but this is like a twinning gesture, right? And the weird thing is people really do this a lot. Like it naturally happens, but in animation it's a little boring to watch, right? So one of the things you could do to that is actually just work on it in the pose, right? Like this gesture instead of this gesture, right? But the other thing you can do is you can make those arms hit at a different time, right? So for example, instead of this, right, you could get this. Right? Just got a little bit of a looseness to it to have them happening at just slightly different times. And it may only be off by like a frame, but it'll help. Okay, so this is the majority of what I call splining, right? This last little section is the stuff that most people couldn't identify as something wrong with it, right? If you played this for a cousin or something, they would be like, yeah, that looks good. But they may feel like something is off. They just can't express what it is, right? This last section, though, is also what animators are looking for when they're trying to hire you, right? They're looking to see that you understand this stuff. This is that level we add in there because we want to impress other animators, right? Sometimes you don't get to all of these. Like if you may be in some game production and you're like, you know what, we got 3 days to get this character done. You're like, all right, we're gonna have to skip some of this polish to get that in there. Maybe we'll polish the animations that are gonna be seen the most, but some of those others that aren't gonna be seen very often will not have time to do the polish on those, right? You always want to get to this stage, but this is the stage that, frankly, a lot of times students never make it to. Like they get bogged down in this part before. So this is really a lot of times what we're focusing on when you're going through portfolio review, and we're like, we need to get this one up to shape for putting in your demo reel. Some of it is stuff like adding detail motions in the head where needed. Little things like that, like let's say your character's really frustrated with something, and when they raise their head up, you add just a little shimmy of like a rotation as it goes up, right? like little tiny details in there to add character, right? Little things that you may not notice when a character is talking. If they say a word that like they emphasize a word really big, their head will nudge just a little bit, right? Like they're almost accenting with their whole head. We can also add detailed animation to the hands where needed. So, little things like little gestures that your hands will make, little swirlies or whatever. One of the things that I notice, it's very easy to do, right? Like a lot of times you're not doing specific things with your hands when you're talking or when you're just hanging out, right? And so your hand ends up feeling like it's always in this one pose, like this kind of casual, like loose pose. And even though it's a very like casual pose, if you never move from it, it feels like a wooden hand still yet, right? And so you still need some transition stuff, right? As I'm going from here over to here, maybe what I would do is add some accentuation through the middle, right? And that can just be like, I have this key pose, I have this key pose, I have a breakdown in the middle where I dragged my fingers back, right? And if you're dragging them back, maybe once you get to here, you overshoot just a little bit, So it's little details like that in the fingers. Now there's some things the fingers do that are very distinctive to fingers, including your hands don't all move together like that, right? Unless you're, I don't know, that just feels creepy or weird. Like it feels like I'm a monster. Your fingers kind of unfold and move individually, right? They offset from each other. And they offset in a very specific way, right? So if you're opening your hand, you'll notice that usually your index finger opens first, your pinky opens last. Try to do it the other way. It's really kind of hard, right? Because naturally we just unfold it that way. Now you may be like close to opening it all together, but if you watch people like when they're talking, these don't move as much as these do, right? And so that means like that you kind of lead with those. Now when you're closing your hand though, it goes the other way, right? You close with your pinky first and your index last. Now, the other thing about that is you have 3 joints in your finger, right? And when your hand is closing, usually those end 2 joints bend first, and then your first knuckle there bends last. So look how you kind of close that, right? So that means you can offset those keyframes or those controls as well to get a more natural hand close. As you open, it actually goes in the other direction. That first joint goes first, and then those others unfold, right? So little things like that are just little things you can offset to get more loose feeling fingers. You can double check your curves to eliminate any noticeable pops. So when you'll hear people talk about pops or hitches. When we were doing that one curve that I said slowed down in the middle before it moved on, like it may be something like that. Maybe your character's making a gesture and they feel like they hesitate just a little bit in the middle of it. And you're just trying to clean those up. Now, a lot of those are going to be associated with arcs. Right? So I think you saw earlier, you can use that editable motion trail to track arcs of different parts of your body. So you can track arcs of your hands, of your feet, right? Even your character's hips, if you want to make sure that sort of that side-to-side motion is working. You can track all of those points, and you will get a nice motion curve in there that'll let you see where those hitches are. Right? There are other things that you don't always think to track, like the tip of your nose. Right? When you're gesturing, right, your head. Well, we saw earlier with fear in an Inside Out clip, like your nose makes a very specific arc. When I turn my head and do a gesture, if I keep a cleaner arc on my nose, it's not going to be noticeable if it's not there, but if it is there, it's going to feel like it just got a little bit more polish and refinement. Your animation actually needs to be a little bit more polished than real life is. You're also going to add any detailed contact information. So when things touch each other, they start to change each other a little bit. So like if you sit down in a chair, like maybe obviously your butt flattens out a little bit because you're putting all that weight on it, but think of it more like with your hand, right? If I'm pushing against something with my finger, if I do like that and it moves, that doesn't seem believable. If the tip of my finger bends back while I'm pushing it, it does. Right? Little things that might happen, like if you're animating a character that has visible toes, when they hit the ground and absorb that weight, the toes may spread apart just a little bit as they're absorbing that weight. Right? So there's lots of little detail things in there that are just going to add to that believability of it. You're going to be able to feel it, not necessarily see it. Fingers squash on contact, and then the last thing is stuff like eye darts and stuff like that. If your character has eyes, our eyes never really completely stop moving. Like they will a little bit, they'll lock onto something, but like my eyes will not drift from here across the room. Like it's almost like try looking at one thing on one side of the room and getting your eyes to slowly go to the other side of the room. You can't do it because your eyes are these little tracking machines. They lock onto things and dart across the room. And so when we animate our eyes, we animate them sort of darting around too. And so it gives them like these little twitching motions that they have. Even when they're mostly staring at one thing, they're still kind of doing this little dart around. So, whew, that was a lot of stuff. This list is here for you. You can print it out. You can literally print this out and use it as a checklist if you wanted to. But what I thought I'd show you is the first half of me splining that little girl doing the backflip, right? The first thing I did once I converted this to splined mode, I took this out of, I took this out of stepped mode. I just go in here, select all the keys. For you, if you're using enable step preview, you just uncheck it, turn it to auto, and we're going to address the first little issue, which is that, right? Her flip, she really messes up. The reason for this, like if we stop here and look at this, look at that red curve, right? So it's our rotate X, and I'll isolate it here in a second, and we'll look at it. Okay. So this is her turning a front flip forward. That's that rotate X should be her turning a front flip forward. And you should recognize that 360 degrees of an object looks exactly like 0 degrees. Right? And so what's happened is Maya has, when I was setting these poses, it was like, yeah, you must want 0. But I really wanted 360. And so you can see my curve. I'm climbing toward 360, and then I shoot back down to 0. Right? And I could fix this. I could grab all of those keys and move them back up to where I want them to be. But then all the rest of my keys will be off. I'd have to get it exactly perfect to make that happen. And this happens a lot. Like you'll run into this. This is an issue in the gimbal rotation. It's not what people call gimbal lock, but it's sort of an issue in that way Maya interpolates curves, right? So since this happens so much, there's a button for it. And so you'll see that I go in here, I select all my channels, right? And watch what happens. I go to curves, there, Euler filter, E-U-L-E-R. It looks like Euler, apparently it's pronounced Euler. Watch what happens to my curves when I click it. Basically what this filter does is it runs this like this algorithm on it to see what it may have gotten wrong or how it could more easily simplify these rotations. And usually it guesses right. So if I hit play, I click the Euler filter, watch what happens here. It shifts all of my curves, and now instead of going back to 0, it continues to climb to the point that I want it to be. So her hips are fixed. Now her head, her arms, and her legs are still messed up. So really all I do is go through there and I run the Euler filter on all of those as well. Now this is why we focus on stepped mode, or while we're just focusing on the poses in stepped mode. Is I could fight with this all day long while I'm keying this, and it would keep getting it wrong, right? That's the transitions. That wasn't the part I should have been looking at yet. So now I think it's all fixed. Yeah, there he is. So she lands a little bit better. So at that point I was supposed to be looking at the poses. That was my job, was to make good poses. Now it's to make these in-betweens happen better, and there's tools, there are techniques in which I can do that, including the Euler filter. So just to show you, after running that Euler filter on everything, I'm going to open this with, so after running that Euler filter on everything, that's what I get. Right. So I'll play it again. And that's not as upsetting. Like, the timing is still off. It still feels a little stiff. The steps don't feel exactly right as the way she's running in. It feels a little light. Like the way she pops back feels a little hard and jolting. But this is feeling better. I can look at this and feel like I can get this to a finished place now, right? Now, if you hit spline on it and it just does not make sense to you, you may not be finished in your breakdown phase yet. You may want to go back to stepped and make sure you have enough keys to clearly show the poses, or to show the actions you're wanting to show, right? But I think I have enough in this to where I can move on. So that means I'm going to now start working on that center of gravity, the hip controller. So for her, I'm going to start with my translate X, right? And translate X is the side-to-side motion. So I go in my perspective view to this angle where I can focus on what she's doing side to side. So like when it goes up, her hips go in one direction. When it goes down, her hips go in the other direction. And I look at it from here and analyze just that side-to-side motion as I'm working on my curve. Right? After I get that, I go to translate Y, which is the up and down. Right? Now, the up and down curve is one of the ways I'll be able to get a little bit more of that weight in there. Like remember the bouncing ball falls kind of fast, like at the end. So I can adjust how quickly like each of those steps hit. And you'll see what I'm doing. Some of it I'm adding some more key poses when I have to on individual items, and adjusting small things. So that's that editable motion trail I'm using to kind of clean up the arc of her jump. And then the forward and back is the translate Z. So I'm going through and manually cleaning all of those up. I'm also pushing it just a little bit when I get the chance. So. Okay. I play blasted here just so I could see it in real time. At that point, you would need to, like it was lagging a little bit for me. Maya now has animation caching. It's that little blue line that slowly grows across the bottom of your screen. And so that means it should play it back in your viewport at real time as long as that's happening. But sometimes it's nice to play blasted just so you have that video to watch and be like, you can scoot back away from it, you can just let it play over and over again, right? So now I'm on to the rotate X. The rotate X is sort of how she rotates forward and back. That's how she does that front flip. This is where the Euler interpolation was messing up earlier. You can see that I'm kind of adding a little bit here to keep that easing happening. So rotate Y. Rotate Y, I think it's her twist, yeah. Oh, I'm back on translate Z. Yeah, so I'm sort of going back and forth between the two. Now, I know this seems like I'm being very nitpicky, but these curves, these 6 curves, affect everything else in the entire animation. So I really want to make sure that I'm getting them right, like that I'm getting them to do what I want them to do. So I'm finally on to rotate Z. Rotate Z is sort of her lean from side to side. And you'll see that I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between different curves. You'll also see where I'm offsetting stuff, sometimes just one frame at a time. My timeline's getting way messier. You just need to learn to live with that. Like, that's just how life is. And like, some people that really bothers them. They're like, no, I want everything to be like very clean. Your timeline is going to stop making sense. Actually, the newest version of Maya has a section though where you can highlight parts of your timeline and add bookmarks to it that let you know what that section of keyframes is. So like I could have a bookmark that says this is the part where she's doing the flip, this part is the landing, this part is running up the tree, right? And so that may help a little bit to make you feel more organized. But like that offsetting is part of overlapping action and follow through, right? We eventually have to do some of that anyway. All right. And you'll see that I'm kind of adding a little bit of keys to the feet. Okay.
So, for like the bunny characters, they
Mhm.
have root control, but they also have like waist control. Do you do both of those in the step, or is that the waist part of the spine?
Whichever one you're moving to get the character to move around. Sometimes they'll have like a hip control or something like that, and what that's for is like pelvic like rocking. Like if you wanted them to like sort of like do like a
So
little.
I would just do that in like the spine part.
Probably. I would have to look at. So there's those 3 or 4 spines that go up its back. Those are that's the spine.
Yeah.
There should be a more of a pelvic control.
Yeah, that's what I was like wondering when you do that part.
Yeah, I think that's the one. I can look at it here in a second and let you know. So the other thing do you have a question too, or are you just stretching? So one of the other things I think is worth looking at here, I started on this video, which is just me editing the curves of the root, right? I started on it at 8:42. I ended at 10:30. Right? Almost 2 hours of just that one control. Right? This is the really important one. Like this is the one that you really want to make sure is working well. Once it is, then we can move on to the spine. And if we've spent our time well in this, we've made like strong decisions, then the rest of that will actually go a little bit faster. So assuming that you can sort of zoom through that doesn't actually save you any time. You will end up, if you're not careful, just kind of digging yourself in a hole and just having to go back and fix that root control anyway. So investing time here will save you time in the future. So, okay. So the next video I have here is me going through the feet. Again, mostly what I'm doing here is I'm changing keyframes on when they're pushing off, when they're making contact, and I'm sort of playing with the arcs a little bit too to make sure that they are, like as the foot kicks off back behind her, I have like kick through a little bit and stuff like that. Really what I've done is I've invested a lot of time in getting that hip to feel right. So yeah, you see there what I'm doing is getting that foot out there a little bit ahead of time, make sure it's sort of holding a little longer. So I've invested a lot of time in making the hips feel right, but the reason the hips are moving is because the character's pushing against the ground, right? And so I have to make sure that feels like it makes logical sense. That the reason the hips started moving is because the foot was pushing, and that foot continued to push a little bit longer before moving, right? If the hip starts moving to one side at the same time as a foot picking up off the ground, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like they're actually pushing. And so this is, when we talk about weight, this is where a lot of that weight comes from, right? That sense that gravity is pulling down on your character and your character is pushing back against the ground with their feet in order to not collapse, right? So this is like just kind of using common sense about how gravity works and when these actions should be happening. Feet are a little faster than some other parts because there are large portions of time where your foot is just stuck to the floor, right? Perfectly flat on the floor. In fact, if some of you may end up having trouble with like your foot feeling like it's swimming around on the floor a little bit, not staying stuck to the floor. What you need to do there is go through and make sure that that part of the curve is flat. It's one of the few times that you'll actually want a flat curve. So you never really want a flat curve happening on like your character's hips, because then it freezes, right? The older animators used to call it keep alive. Is that instead of just like if you ever see it, if you just duplicated two key poses and held them, right, it would feel like they got to that key pose and then somebody hit pause. Right? The only time we ever see a character stop moving is when they're dead. Like even when they're sleeping, they're breathing a little bit. You even have like, you still have blood flowing through your body, so your skin actually has like slight movements to it. So it's really unsettling to see a character completely stop moving. And so what we do is we use instead what's called a moving hold, right? Our character's getting into this pose, and then we get them to that pose and sort of keep them somewhere near that pose, right? A very, very similar pose, but not just a copy of that keyframe. And so that's what we would do with everything except for the feet, because the feet are being locked down when they're on the ground, right? They're not moving because our weight and the floor is holding them there. And so that's one of the things that we can use. So call those moving holds or keep alive, and you'll hear me refer to that later here. Is this already looped, or we still got a little ways to go? All right. So some of the things you may be seeing here, like I bent her toe back there right before she hit the ground. I also may, I'm not sure if I do or not, break the tangent when it hits the ground. So you don't really want your foot feeling like it slows down right before it hits the ground. So that spacing usually will be kind of big right before it hits the ground. And you can do some of that manually, or you can break tangents. So, all right. So once you get that feet-hip relationship working, then we can work up the spine through the head. So we're about another hour in at this point, 11:08. So I would say on a good day, splining a shot like this, not polished, but just splining, of where I'm going to have it to by the end of this, I'm guessing somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 hours, maybe 5. And then as we start doing the offsetting down the timeline and some of the polish stuff, I would look at another 4 to 5 hours. So I would think for a 5 to 10 second clip, I would be looking at about 8 hours work, and maybe a little bit more. Depends on how challenging the shot is. Trust me, some shots I've worked on for 6 weeks. It's more like I finished it 20 times is really what happened, and there was always something that needed to be changed in it. And that's just going to happen. Like you're gonna always be able to find ways of making it better. At Askia in Civ 5, I worked on that character forever, and I mean, I would be finished with the character. We would export him, we would get him in the game, and it would just keep coming back, and people would be like, "Oh, that doesn't feel exactly right," and I hated that. Like I was like, I'm just going to throw this character in the garbage. I'm never going to use it when I'm done here, and it ended up being one of some of my better animation in that game because of kind of earned it. Like you had to fight to make that thing actually work. So again, what I'm looking at here is how the root motion is affecting the character's spine. So for her, in a lot of this, it is sort of her hips are leading it, with a few exceptions, like where she throws her head down here. Some of that's a little different. Sort of leading with her head a little bit there as she pops back up. Just going through like one curve at a time and just hoping that it makes sense. So, not hoping, like making it make sense. Hoping it makes sense. Cross your fingers. Maybe we'll get an animation out of it. So I'm not done yet at this point. I still have my offsetting to go. If we're comparing this to the splining checklist, where I am right now is there, right? That's what I've done. So next class period, we're going to talk about some more stuff. We're going to talk about the section 4 here, where I do all that offsetting, refining, splining, and the sort of the final level of polish that I put on it. What I would say is this is where it is up to this point, right? And this is why I play blast it and save these play blasts, right? This feels better to me. There's still some issues, but it feels better to me. And you may not be able to tell unless you go back and watch the one before it. Right? The one before I did all that polish, which is here. So you can tell like the run feels not as good. The arc on the flip doesn't feel as good. The way she jumps off doesn't feel as good. The way she bounces back definitely feels stiffer. Yes?
Can you put them side by side?
I can probably put them back to back. Yeah. So this is the unpolished or unsplined. This is the splined. There's a weird little hitch on the spline where she first comes into scene. That still needs some work. So this is why I say like this is, like I said, 5 hours of work for a very small game, right? But anybody ever heard of the 80-20 rule? Yeah. Effectively, the 80-20 rule is something like you put in 20% of the work to get 80% of the result. But if you want that last 20% of the result, you have to put in the other 80% of the work, right? This is that 80% of the work, and I don't know that I would actually. This maybe isn't the full 80. Like really, you get so much out of those first few keyframes, right? You are all able to understand each other's shots within 48 hours of being assigned that shot, just by like getting your basic key poses in there. That was a huge step. To get this thing to a believable point is a lot of really small polish and detail stuff. And that's why I say when you sometimes have to look for that reason to feel gratified in it, right? And saving these two pieces here, I can see that all that editing I did on the spine and root has really paid off in making it feel a little bit more realistic. I feel like the weight feels way better if you look at the difference between what her feet does and the previous one and this one. That just doesn't feel very weighty at all. And so I can watch these two back to back now and feel like what I did made a difference, right? And that's the hard part about animation is like 5 hours, you would expect that, like people do whole paintings in 5 hours, right? Like, and so you feel like you'd be further along than this. You have to be patient with it. You have to trust the process. It will come together. Like the last little bit that we do is really where everything starts to feel finished and believable. The other thing is, again, it's not always like those differences that you can see, it's those differences that you feel if they're not there. And so that's really what we're trying to get in this last little bit of polish. So, questions, comments, any of this? Okay. So, couple reminders. Next class period, we don't have an actual homework due. I will give you some time to break out into a critique group, probably early on in the class. I would think, but depending on how it's feeling, we may go ahead and do it at the end. Next class period, I'm going to focus pretty heavily on overlapping action. I have a whole lecture on overlapping action that I think makes it make more sense, and I think will help at this point of the polish process to see that. And so we'll look at that, and then we'll look at sort of the last few time lapses of me finishing this up to the point that I got it finished. I'll be honest, like I was doing this along with the class last time I taught it, and it was a lot of work keeping up and teaching other classes and getting everything that I do. So I got it to a good enough point that I'm happy with it. I would actually really love to do one more polish pass on it, and if I manage to find any time during some work time, I may finish that up. So, any questions on any of this? All right, cool. It does appear that I recorded this, so that's cool. I'll go ahead and upload this to YouTube, and actually the rest of the class is yours. So actually that's not as long as I thought it was. That's only about 15 minutes. Well, I guess it's 30. We're here till 5:15 or 5:05? 5:05. I can't do math. It's like 20 minutes. So, and then I'll be going to upload this, and I'll hop around and help anybody with any questions they have. All right, thanks all.